The hill above Red Creek was a demanding mistress, granting peace only after she exacted a high price of toil. The mornings, particularly in the deep valley months, arrived with a bone-deep chill that clung to everything: the rough-cut pine of the cabin, the brittle winter grass, the very air Lucas Grant inhaled. He was always ahead of the sun, stirring long before the first pale streaks of light had the necessary strength to burn the crystalline frost off the highest peaks. At 25 years old, Lucas was built like a post and beam fence, broad-shouldered, sinewy, and possessing a kind of earthbound resilience that seemed etched into the deep lines around his eyes. He moved with a practiced economy, a man shaped by the unrelenting frontier, where self-reliance wasn't a virtue but the primary rule of survival. Out here, a man either learned to stand firm against the wind, or he was quickly forgotten, leaving no trace but a crooked fence line. His cabin, perched precariously against the slope, was a patchwork testament to years of fighting the elements. It was fashioned from unpolished timber and patched so many times with salvaged materials that its structure resembled a strange functional quilt, a history of storms and repairs visible in every overlapping shingle. Yet it was undeniably solid. It offered absolute protection from the brutal winter gusts and the suffocating summer dust storms, and that fidelity was all the luxury Lucas ever required. He harbored no need for unnecessary comfort or decoration, just a roof that didn't leak and enough profound, unbroken quiet to hear the steady, reliable drum of his own thoughts. His day commenced with a ritual as fixed as the North Star, the sulphurous scent of a scraped matchhead followed by the gentle hiss as the flame caught the wick of the oil lamp. Soon after, the iron stove, a heavy antique that had seen generations of use, began its familiar groan as the kettle settled on the grate. Lucas poured himself a mug of black coffee, thick and potent, a brew strong enough, the locals joked, to wake the deceased and convince them to sign a new contract. He'd carry the steaming mug out to his small porch, settling his worn, dust-caked boots onto the railing he had repaired just last spring. From this vantage point, he watched the valley below slowly awaken. The fog, dense and white as spun cotton, gradually surrendered its hold, receding to unveil the endless tapestry of grassland, the meandering, lazy ribbon of the creek, and the distant, dark silhouettes of grazing cattle moving slowly across the earth like somber, shifting clouds. This daily communion with the land was profoundly steadying. It was a landscape of predictable harshness and immutable beauty, a stretch of honesty that required nothing of him but his labor. When the heavy ceramic mug was empty, he would return inside, gather his primary companions, a hickory-handled hammer, a belt loaded with the necessary weight of nails, and a thick spool of fence wire. These tools were his language, his trade, and his most trusted allies, often closer to him than any human soul in Red Creek. Lucas Grant was the region's resident mender, the man called upon when the prairie wind tore the shingles off a ranch roof, or when a restless young bull found a weakness in a corral wall. He never once turned down a job, finding deep, simple satisfaction in the act of fixing things. The work was tangible and truthful, wood was honest, a well-driven post didn't lie, and hinges possessed no capacity for pretense. They were broken, and then they were whole again. People, however, were an entirely different and far more complicated affair, full of shifting motives, silent judgments, and hidden expectations. This profound difference was why Lucas preferred the expansive, untamed solitude of the open land. Out here, the persistent wind didn't interrogate him, the indifferent sky offered no judgment, and a man could inhale without feeling the intangible, demanding tug of expectation at his heels. His life was a constant circuit, riding from one isolated homestead to the next, repairing whatever required a pair of strong, skilled hands. One day might demand the intricate work of fixing a sagging corral gate that threatened to give way. The next, patching a massive barn roof after a particularly violent squall had peeled back the metal like a discarded wrapper. His horse, a steady bay gelding named Copper, knew every rough, dusty trail between the scattered homesteads. They moved as a single unit across the landscape, two creatures seemingly carved from the same durable, stubborn wood of the frontier. The late afternoon marked a subtle shift in Lucas's rigid routine. While most cowboys were contemplating the warmth of the saloon's whiskey or the low, dangerous thrill of a card game, Lucas was invariably turning his horse back toward the small, dusty settlement of Red Creek. He was drawn not by drink or company, but by a small, singular indulgence, the promise of fresh cornbread from the modest bakery located near the creek's edge. This errand, predictable and necessary, inevitably led him to her, Sophie Harper. She stood apart from the other women in Red Creek, possessing a quality of quiet, resolute dignity, an inward-facing strength that did not require loud pronouncements to be profoundly felt. Her heritage, Apache roots from the surrounding plains, was evident in the long, dark braid that draped over her shoulder, the profound stillness in her dark eyes, and the almost musical way her voice seemed to smooth and soften the harsh air of the frontier whenever she chose to speak. Lucas never permitted himself to linger too long at her counter. He would offer a curt nod, maybe manage a shy, clumsy smile, stammering out a few awkward, unremarkable words about the ever-changing weather or the severity of the most recent windstorm. He knew he lacked grace and charm with women. His hands were perpetually rough and cracked from handling harsh fence wire, and his shirt carried the faint, honest odor of horse sweat, leather and cedar shavings from his lumberwork. Yet Sophie never seemed to mind his awkwardness. She would accept his payment with a gentle, patient grace, handing him a loaf still warm from the oven, and on occasion her fingers would brush against his for a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary. She always thanked him with a gentle sincerity, as though he had performed some remarkable service just by purchasing bread. That fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, the startling warmth of her hand, the gentle earnestness of her smile, the faint, comforting scent of cornmeal and wild sage that seemed to cling to her clothes, followed him all the long ride home. Despite this magnetic pull, he consciously maintained his distance. A practical, solitary man like Lucas had no business entertaining fanciful notions about a woman like Sophie, who clearly deserved far more than a lonely, itinerant cowboy whose most valuable possessions were a run-down cabin and a toolbox full of hammers. But when the days stretched into a silent, monotonous expanse and the nights grew too quiet, he often found his thoughts inevitably drifting back to her, her steady, unwavering gaze, the soft, low hum she sometimes made under her breath while carefully arranging her baked goods, the way the light from her window caught her dark braid. He would never admit it to another soul, but Sophie Harper had subtly woven herself into the very fabric of his routine, becoming a singular point of anticipation he hadn't consciously sought. She was the reason Red Creek felt less like a temporary stop and more like a necessary place to return. Lucas had always considered himself a man content with solitude, a conviction he had held steadfastly until the quiet, unremarkable day when everything subtly began to shift. The day a single, unassuming glance from Sophie would manage to shake him more thoroughly than any angry storm the prairie had ever unleashed. The creek running behind Sophie Harper's cabin possessed a constant, low voice. Even during the devastating drought years, when the cracked earth resembled old, desiccated leather, that narrow, resilient ribbon of water still stubbornly found a way to flow, moving with a soft, steady whisper against the sun-baked stones. Sophie found deep comfort in that sound. It was a perpetual, gentle reminder of a distant home, of places she knew she could no longer return to, and of the beloved faces she had trained herself not to recall too vividly. Her cabin, small and built from cedar logs that had aged to a dark, rich umber, was nestled beneath the protective canopy of an ancient cottonwood tree, whose massive branches swayed and rustled like a mother soothing a restless child. Every morning, precisely as the pale sky transitioned from the slate gray of pre-dawn to a deep, hopeful blue, a thin stream of smoke would curl up from her chimney, gentle, almost translucent, and undeniably inviting. Anyone in Red Creek who caught its earthy, sweet scent knew Sophie was already at work, her hands deep in the dough. Sophie Harper, 33 years old, the daughter of the vast Apache plains, carried within her the ancient, meticulous knowledge of baking, taught to her by her revered grandmother. Her work transcended the settlers' stiff, flavorless white loaves. She crafted warm, richly textured cornbread, delicate honey biscuits, pine nut rolls that spoke of the earth, and fried bread so perfectly soft it tasted like a cherished, half-forgotten memory. These were the only true possessions she had carried with her when she left her people behind, and they were the only things that possessed the power to make her harsh, new world feel even remotely familiar again. Her hands moved with a hypnotic, careful rhythm each morning, meticulously mixing the cornmeal, folding in rich wild honey collected from the nearby canyon mouths, and grinding pine nuts with the same smooth, flat stone her grandmother had used decades before. She worked in deep silence, allowing her thoughts to drift and scatter like dust motes in the single sharp shaft of sunlight that cut through her small cabin window. Here, in the quiet, solitude was not a burden, but a necessary, invaluable shield. Red Creek had, to her surprise, proven relatively kind, offering her a space of quiet acceptance. The townspeople were practical, unpretentious people who focused on survival. They bought her bread, often complimented her delicate needlework, and mostly allowed her to maintain her simple, quiet life near the talking creek. She never spoke of why she had departed from her tribe, nor did she reveal the nature of the deep, quiet hurt she carried beneath her calm, composed surface. The people in town, in the absence of truth, simply invented their own stories, and Sophie permitted them this fiction. Sometimes it was significantly easier to be a comfortable mystery. A few times a week, she would load her baskets with warm, fresh bread and make her rounds to the trading post, the small schoolhouse, or to any family or elderly person who had offered her small kindnesses. She never accepted payment from the elderly or from families visibly struggling through the hard seasons. Her generosity was quiet, unassuming, woven seamlessly into the very fabric of how she chose to live in the world. Yet no matter how many faces she encountered on these errands, there was one face she found herself watching for without ever admitting the anticipation. Lucas Grant, the tall cowboy with the profoundly quiet eyes and hands rough from labor, the man who always carried the faint, clean scent of cedar and sun-warmed leather. Lucas Grant was younger than Sophie by almost a full decade, yet there was something about his demeanor that felt substantially older, steadier, like the ancient, unmoving land itself had shaped him and imbued him with its own profound patience. Most men made Sophie instinctively recoil, her protective guard instantly rising before she could even consciously process the interaction. She had learned a difficult, painful lesson early in life. Attention from men often came tethered to heavy expectations and demands for conformity. But Lucas, she realized, was fundamentally different. He never loitered at her bakery counter, never pressed a conversation past the point where she was perfectly comfortable, and when he spoke, his voice was always low and soft, as if intentionally giving her ample space to retreat, should she need to. That quiet, inherent respect, she found, paradoxically made her want to remain precisely where she was. She began to catalogue the small details about him she had no business noticing. The way his dark, thick lashes caught the morning light just so, the slight nervous tap of his thumb against the paper wrapping of her bread whenever shyness overcame him, and how he always deliberately stood a little farther back than other men, meticulously affording her room, air, and privacy. Respect, she understood, was built into every deliberate action he took. This unexpected, unwavering respect initially unnerved her, challenging her established walls of self-protection. Soon, however, it began to deeply comfort her. Still, she maintained a strict internal decree. She did not allow herself to imagine a future, or even a close friendship, with him. She had already navigated the devastating disappointment of trusting the wrong people, of being repeatedly told, in various ways, that she did not fit in, that she didn't truly belong, and that she couldn't be genuinely loved unless she relinquished essential parts of herself, parts she had no intention of ever giving away. She had walked away from that prior life with her heart scraped, raw and brittle, carrying nothing but a handful of cherished recipes and a quiet, immutable resolve to never be vulnerable in that way again. Therefore, when Lucas offered her one of his genuine, unhurried, silent smiles, she refused to permit herself to read anything significant into the gesture. She couldn't afford the risk. Yet, the feeling persisted, soft and persistent. Some afternoons, she would catch a glimpse of him riding past her cabin on Copper, the quiet clinking of his tools in the saddlebag, providing a subtle, familiar rhythm to the day. She never initiated the greeting, never waved first. But when he lifted his hand in a simple, earnest wave, her heart performed a small, traitorous flutter deep within her chest. It wasn't yet love, not a grand, sweeping emotion. It was something far gentler, like the quiet, comforting warmth of bread slowly rising under a thick cloth. Soft, gradual, almost hesitant. Still, Sophie knew herself well enough to recognize the subtle, creeping danger. Feelings, especially those she consciously avoided, had an insidious way of slipping past even the strongest, highest emotional walls she had constructed. The entire life she had so painstakingly built in Red Creek was predicated on maintaining her emotional equilibrium. staying steady, remaining deliberately alone, and most importantly, staying safe from heartbreak. Except when it came to Lucas Grant, safe felt increasingly synonymous with lonely. And for the very first time in years, the quiet, persistent voice of the creek behind her cabin seemed to whisper that it wasn't the only thing in her life that was quietly, steadily moving toward something entirely new and uncertain. The wind in Red Creek, as relentless as time itself, truly possessed a mind of its own. Some days, it moved like a lazy, gentle whisper, merely rustling the leaves of the cottonwoods with a soothing sound. On others, it would barrel across the sprawling valley with the unpredictable, explosive temper of a wild, unbroken Mustang. The night before had been one of the angry ones, a tempest that had left the townspeople waking to overturned water buckets, scuffed and torn soil, and fence lines leaning at impossible angles like tired, defeated old men after an impossibly long shift. Sophie Harper, however, woke to something considerably worse and more immediate. 3 heavy fence rails lying snapped and crooked in the dust, cleanly broken where the wind had violently slammed an old thick tree branch into them. She knew instinctively that she wasn't physically strong enough to lift and reset the heavy old posts alone. This knowledge was coupled with her deep, ingrained dislike of asking for external help, yet her hands hesitated only for a brief moment before she reached for the small iron tin bell that hung subtly by her porch door. Everyone in the close-knit community of Red Creek knew that the delicate sound of that specific bell was a quiet call reserved for only one man, and as the day wore on, he inevitably came. By late afternoon, Lucas Grant was dismounting and tying copper to a remaining sturdy fence post, his eyes squinting professionally at the broken rails with the practiced, meticulous eye of a man who had undoubtedly mended more fence lines than he could possibly count. "Wind gave you a mighty hard time, didn't it?" he muttered, already rolling up the sleeves of his worn flannel shirt to reveal powerful forearms. Sophie nodded once from her porch, her fingers unconsciously kneading a lump of bread dough she had carried outside with her, a nervous habit that provided her with a calming, tactile distraction. "It always seems to hit this exact corner first," she explained quietly. Lucas meticulously tested the structural integrity of the remaining posts, his calloused hands moving with an assured, steady confidence. "Lucky thing it didn't take the whole line down. These rails are old, Sophie. I can reinforce the joints properly once I get the new, heavier pieces set," he analyzed. She watched him work, in the deepening afternoon light, quietly, almost too quietly. Lucas was not a man who ever felt the need to fill the air with unnecessary empty chatter. He preferred to let the deliberate, rhythmic sound of his hammer, the thud, 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 speak for him. The sun began its slow dip toward the horizon, brushing the side of his concentration-etched face with a warm, ephemeral gold as he crouched in the dry, dusty earth, carefully maneuvering a heavy board into its designated place. For a long while, the only sounds that existed were the sharp, consistent strikes of the hammer, the dry, soft rustle of the prairie grass, and the quiet, comforting crumbling of the dough between Sophie's gentle fingers. Finally, unable to bear the prolonged silence, she spoke. "You work faster and cleaner than most men I've seen in this valley." Lucas let out a small, warm puff of air that was almost a laugh. "Most men don't fight fences for a living, Sophie. It's a different kind of fight," he responded, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a wrist already dusted with dirt. "Besides, this one is nothing. I've seen rails get torn up so bad by a cyclone they look like chewed, bleached bones." Sophie permitted herself a rare, subtle smile, just barely visible, but it was enough for Lucas to notice, and the sight of it arrested him for a microsecond. Her smile, small and quiet as it was, landed on him with the surprising, intense warmth of sunlight on frozen ground. He kept talking, which was unusual for him. He couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was because she was listening to him with that soft, intensely attentive way she had, head tilted slightly, her eyes warm and deep but still subtly guarded. "The storm season is coming in early this year," he observed, driving a nail home with a single, powerful stroke. "The ranchers are already grumbling and complaining. Heard the Carlton brothers lost almost half their chicken coop roof last week. They'll be fixing that for days." Sophie made a soft sound that was almost a delicate laugh. "Their roof always flies off. They nail it down like they're terribly afraid to wake the chickens, she said, her humor coming out unexpectedly, light as the sound of distant wind chimes, fleeting as a falling autumn leaf. Lucas couldn't help but grin, a full, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Sophie's fingers continued their steady, mesmerizing motion, shaping the dough in her hands, rolling it into a perfect small ball, flattening it, then starting the entire calming process over again. "My oven nearly gave out entirely again this morning," she confessed, her voice dropping slightly. "I think the main stone plate is deeply cracked this time. It doesn't hold the heat evenly anymore." "Do you want me to take a good look at it?" Lucas asked immediately, the question escaping his lips before he could fully process the unexpected implication of his own offer. Her dark eyes lifted to meet his, calm, deep, and studying. "You've already helped me significantly with the fence, Lucas. I don't want to take up your entire day. You have other work, I'm sure." "It's truly no trouble at all, Sophie," he insisted, tightening the final nail with a professional precision. He stood up, slowly dusted the grime off his jeans with his hands. "I'm around the valley anyway. You just have to say the word and I'll come check it out." She didn't offer an immediate yes. She didn't offer a definitive no either. But the subtle way she glanced quickly toward the cabin, then back down at the soft dough in her hands, told him everything he needed to know. They continued to speak for a little while longer, simple, benign topics about the transient families passing through the valley that week, the joyous news of a new baby born over at the Hardin Ranch, and the recurring, hopeful rumor that Red Creek might finally manage to open a necessary second town well. Simple things, common, everyday things. Yet somehow, in the warm, late-day stillness, these subjects felt different, weighted with an ease and familiarity that Lucas rarely found with anyone else. He stayed on her property much longer than he had originally intended. The sun sank farther, painting the porch and the yard in deep hues of copper and amber, and still he lingered near the porch steps. Sophie felt it too, that quiet, persistent pull between them, a nameless tension that settled in the air like the soft evening breeze, subtle yet utterly undeniable. For the very first time in years, a man's proximity did not make her feel tense or anxious. It did not make her heart immediately curl inward, retreating into a protective shell. Instead, she found her lips curving just slightly into a genuine laugh when Lucas offered a dry, amused comment about the notoriously stubborn mule belonging to the ranching neighbor. The sound of her own laughter startled her. She hadn't anticipated it, but Lucas heard it, and something deep within his chest tightened in a way he had never quite understood before. When he finally gathered his primary tools and began his slow step toward copper, Sophie called out gently after him, "Thank you, truly, Lucas." He touched the worn brim of his hat in acknowledgement, his voice low and sincere. "Anytime, Sophie. Anytime you need." As he rode away, the evening wind shifted direction, carrying with it the familiar warm scent of her baking. He realized, with a quiet, powerful jolt, that he wished the fence had actually taken just a little longer to mend. And Sophie, standing utterly still on the porch with her hands dusted white with flour and cornmeal, realized that for the first time in a very long while, she didn't mind the profound, unsettling idea of someone like Lucas staying just a little bit longer. The morning had started with a profound, almost deceptive quietness. Red Creek waking slowly under a pale, washed-out sky. The faint, clean smell of fresh earth, rich and dark, drifted pleasantly through the valley after a light, sporadic drizzle during the night. Sophie Harper had just finished meticulously packing a large basket overflowing with warm, plump honey biscuits when she stepped out, intending to walk toward the trading post, her shawl wrapped tightly around her against the lingering damp chill. It was exactly the kind of calm, predictable and industrious morning she had cultivated and usually cherished, a day that promised safety and routine. But calm has a treacherous way of shattering abruptly when the ghosts of the past decide, without warning, to aggressively tug at the seams of the present. She certainly didn't expect to see Lucas so early in the day, and she was even more unprepared to see him in the company of someone else. Near the general store's hitching post, a young woman was standing, waving both arms in a wide, exuberant gesture, as if she had waited years in that exact spot just to spot him. This was Lily, bright-eyed, endlessly talkative, the sort of person whose laughter, light and unrestrained, seemed to travel significantly farther than her actual footsteps. Sophie had seen the girl once or twice before in town, usually in the company of a merchant family, but never this close, and certainly never standing in such immediate, intimate proximity to Lucas. Lucas was in the process of carefully lifting a heavy, battered tool crate from the back of Lily's wagon, setting it gently onto the dusty ground as the young woman chattered on excitedly about something Sophie was too far away to hear. He looked completely relaxed, smiling a quiet, easy smile she realized she had rarely, if ever, seen directed toward anyone else. And then the small, defining moment happened. Lily reached up effortlessly, looping an arm around Lucas's broad shoulders, pulling him into a breezy, utterly familiar embrace. Before Sophie had the necessary time to fully process the casual sight, Lily quickly pressed a brief, affectionate kiss to Lucas's cheek. The kind of spontaneous, effortless gesture belonging exclusively to people who had shared an unshakable history, who had known each other for an incredibly long time. It was nothing inherently romantic, nothing overtly heated, but the easy physicality of the action struck Sophie with the unexpected sharp force of a thrown arrow all the same. Sophie instantly halted mid-step, the heavy, warm basket in her hands suddenly feeling impossibly dense. A sharp, intense, unexpected sting tightened painfully beneath her ribs. It wasn't quite anger, not exactly, but something far older, far deeper, and rooted in an ancient fear she had worked tirelessly to bury deep beneath the protective layers of her quiet, predictable routines. Her past life had taught her a cruel lesson. What happens when the object of a man's affection subtly shifts? How quickly one can become utterly invisible, and how easily even the most solemn of promises could suddenly crumble into dust. Standing there on that quiet, dusty street, watching Lucas with someone who fit so comfortably, so naturally into his world, she felt that familiar, old, devastating ache of abandonment rising again in her throat. Lily laughed, a sharp, clear sound, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Lucas responded with something in return, his voice low and inherently patient, and he did not pull away from Lily's lingering touch. Crucially, he did not seem to notice Sophie at all in her peripheral vision. That particular detail hurt her most deeply of all. Sophie forced her frozen feet to move forward, her gaze fixed rigidly ahead, her jaw set tight with forced resolve. She kept walking with an unnerving, deliberate stiffness, the basket held steady against her hip, her heart inexplicably pounding harder than it logically should have been. When she finally passed the pair, Lucas momentarily looked up for just a breath, long enough to catch sight of her dark braid, her tightly wrapped shawl, and her posture, held unnaturally stiff and straight. But Sophie didn't allow herself to look back. She couldn't. If she had, he might have instantly seen every turbulent, raw emotion she was desperately working to conceal. By the time she reached the relative safety of the trading post, her hands were trembling ever so slightly, a microscopic tremor that betrayed her internal turmoil. She set the heavy basket down on the wooden counter with a thump and quickly stepped away, fighting the almost overwhelming impulse to abandon her errands entirely and retreat immediately to the quiet, protective safety of her cabin by the creek. But running away from challenging feelings had never solved anything. She had learned that painful lesson already. Still, she did not, as she often did, return to the road that curved toward Lucas's cabin that afternoon. She did not bring him a fresh, warm loaf of cornbread or casually inquire if he needed assistance gathering lumber for his next job. She did not even walk down the road that led in the direction of his place. Instead, she remained fiercely cloistered at home, kneading dough until the deep, persistent ache in her arms finally surpassed the sharp emotional thrum in her chest. She worked in a profound, self-imposed silence, allowing the repetitive, steady rhythm of her palms folding into the soft mixture to quiet her ragged breathing and her turbulent emotions. Meanwhile, miles away, Lucas felt the fundamental shift the very moment he returned to his own home. He had grown subconsciously reliant on the soft, predictable knock on his door around dusk. Sophie standing there with a basket or a jar of something warm, offering the kind of gentle, undemanding company he was incapable of asking for himself. But this evening, his porch remained empty and silent. He checked the path once, then again, then finally sat heavily on his steps as the sun, an angry red disk, slid behind the distant shadowed hills, feeling profoundly unsettled by an unfamiliar feeling he couldn't accurately name. He began to replay the entire day in his mind, searching frantically for anything he might have done wrong, any misplaced word or action. Finally, the memory surfaced, the brief moment he glimpsed Sophie walking past him on the street. He remembered the unnatural stiffness in her shoulders, the way her eyes remained resolutely straight ahead, as if he were a complete, unimportant stranger. Something internal tightened with a mix of utter confusion and a low, utterly foreign disappointment. He didn't know what mistake he had made. He only knew, with crushing certainty, that the quiet space between them felt fundamentally different tonight, sharper, cooler, and impossibly weighty. His life, which had just begun to settle into a rhythm of unexpected warmth, suddenly felt tilted and unstable. He spent the evening trying and failing to focus on sharpening his favorite tools or meticulously patching a saddle strap that didn't strictly need repair, but every task felt wrong, fundamentally unbalanced. He found himself staring out at the dark, silent road again and again, irrationally hoping she might suddenly appear in the fading light. She didn't. As the large moon climbed high into the black, silent sky, the devastating realization settled deep in his chest. Heavy, aching, and impossible to avoid. Solitude had always been his necessary shield, the protective barrier he carried against the demanding world. But now, stripped of Sophie's brief, quiet presence, it felt less like a shield and more like a crushing, unwarranted punishment. He missed her with an intensity he didn't know he was capable of. But Sophie knew the source of the cut. She knew exactly what had stung her. Even if she rationally told herself it shouldn't have mattered, yet it did, profoundly, because somewhere between the quiet, shared labor of mending fences and the hesitant sharing of simple words, Lucas Grant had subtly begun to mean far more to her than she had ever consciously intended to allow. And the sudden, sharp prick of jealousy, small and instantaneous yet impossible to ignore, was the very first undeniable sign that she could no longer pretend otherwise. The silence between them settled slowly, softly, like fine dust drifting through a sunbeam. It was so subtle at first that Lucas didn't register the difference immediately. But by the second day, when the familiar welcome knock failed to sound on his porch, when no warm loaf appeared magically wrapped in clean cloth, and when the evening light faded completely without a single glimpse of Sophie's dark braid on the road, he began to truly feel the crushing weight of her absence. Something was profoundly wrong. He attempted to rationalize it, telling himself she was merely deeply busy baking for a large order, delivering bread to a distant ranch, or perhaps helping one of the older, infirm women in town. But the excuses felt hollow and entirely unconvincing, even to him. Sophie had swiftly become as steady and reliable to him as his morning cup of bitter coffee or the habitual, comforting creak of the porch boards beneath his heavy boots. When something that's steady abruptly vanishes, a man feels the change deep in his bones, and Lucas felt it in a raw, unprepared way that confused and angered him. On the third day of the total silence, after pacing the confines of his small cabin more times than he would ever dare admit to another soul, he finally saddled Copper with a determined snap and rode down the hill towards Sophie's place. The air that morning held the bright, crisp, almost sharp quality of early fall, and the cottonwood trees rattled their dry leaves like quiet, fragile warnings. Lucas attempted to ignore the uncomfortable, unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he approached her cabin, the telltale smoke curling gently from her chimney, a subtle hint that she was at least safely home and working her routine. He counted that as the solitary good sign he had found. He dismounted Copper, walked directly across her small, dusty yard, and knocked lightly, tentatively, on the doorframe. "Sophie, it's me, Lucas. Thought I'd finally come check that porch beam before the deep winter weather finally settles in," he called out. There was a prolonged, heavy pause, long enough for him to hear the hypnotic, low murmur of the creek behind her cabin. Long enough for him to wonder, with a sudden surge of fear, if she would even deign to answer him at all. Then, the door opened only a fraction, just enough for her calm, composed face to appear in the narrow gap. Her expression was utterly calm, too calm. "Lucas, today really isn't a very good time," she said, her voice polite but carrying an unmistakable finality. He blinked, momentarily stunned by the quiet rejection in her tone. "It truly won't take me long, Sophie. That beam has been visibly sagging since the last significant storm. It needs a quick fix." "I'll manage it myself," she replied softly, gently, but resolutely. "I truly don't want to trouble you." "Trouble me?" Lucas almost shouted the word aloud, barely catching himself. Since when did she speak to him as if he were merely a stranger she wished to politely dismiss? Before he could gather his scattered thoughts and form a protest, Sophie added, "I really should get back to my work now." And she gently, deliberately pulled the door closed. The latch clicked shut with a small, sharp sound that echoed loudly in the quiet afternoon air. Lucas stood there for a long time, staring blankly at the rough wood grain directly in front of him. The door hadn't been slammed, her voice hadn't been sharp or angry, but somehow the quiet, measured push of distance cut him deeper than any harsh word could have. He turned away slowly, walking back to Copper with a profound heaviness in his steps that he couldn't begin to understand. He was fundamentally unused to needing people. He was fundamentally unused to wanting someone to look at him with the specific kind of warmth Sophie sometimes had. He was absolutely unused to the sharp, cutting feeling of rejection. All the long way home, the memory of the warm scent of her baking seemed to cling aggressively to him. Warm honey, toasted corn, pine nuts roasted just enough to release their full sweetness. He had always liked that specific scent. Now it twisted inside him, hollowing him out from the inside. For the first time in years, Lucas realized his simple cabin felt too large, too silent, and overwhelmingly empty. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It scraped at him, sharp, unfamiliar, and unforgiving. Lucas slumped heavily back into his familiar wooden chair, staring blankly at the empty space where Sophie typically sat when she visited, the spot where she always set her basket, the exact place where her soft, surprising laugh had once temporarily filled the room. He rubbed his rugged jaw, frustrated by an emotion he could neither name nor control. He missed her company, missed her voice, which was always calm and measured, like she meticulously chose kindness with every syllable she spoke. He missed the way she specifically looked at him, steady, thoughtful, and never, ever judging. Most of all, he missed the quiet, powerful comfort of her presence, which was soft as a warm, crackling fire and twice as grounding and reliable. It struck him then, sudden and completely undeniable, like a hammer meeting a crooked, stubborn nail. He had become utterly reliant on her, grown accustomed to her consistent presence, to her predictable visits, to the sound of her approaching footsteps on his porch. And now that she had deliberately and quietly pulled away, his entire world felt jarringly uneven, like a long fence line missing its crucial, stabilizing center rail. That night, he tried desperately to focus on mending his tools or finally patching the old saddle strap, but every single task felt wrong, fundamentally off balance. He found himself staring restlessly at the dark road outside again and again, hoping with a foolish, desperate hope that she might miraculously appear in the faint, fading light. She didn't. And as the moon silently climbed high above the ridges, the realization settled deep in his chest, heavy, aching, and now completely impossible to ignore. Solitude had always been his chosen shield, the strength he relied upon. But now, without Sophie's quiet, essential presence, it felt overwhelmingly like punishment rather than peace. Lucas Grant was absolutely not a man who baked. He could expertly build a 5-strand barbed wire fence in half the time of anyone else in Red Creek, straighten a heavily warped structural beam with nothing but pure sweat and innate instinct, and competently repair a massive barn roof in the torrential middle of a raging storm. But baking, that was an entirely different, delicate fight, a world he did not understand. Still, he tried. That very morning he stood inside his small cabin, staring at a lopsided, sad loaf of cornbread cooling haphazardly on his table. It was visibly uneven, too pale in some places, aggressively dark and scorched in others. He had mistakenly used the wrong pan, clumsily burned his thumb on the handle, and nearly set a cloth towel on fire during the ordeal. But he had made it, every clumsy bit of it, for her. He still didn't know precisely what he had done to offend her, but he simply could not stomach another agonizing day of Sophie's chilling silence. So he carefully wrapped the heavy, misshapen loaf in clean burlap, mounted Copper, and headed slowly down toward the creek with a heart that pounded harder than the situation justified. When he finally reached her cabin, he spotted her through the small kitchen window, moving quietly and gracefully around her workspace, her dark braid hanging long down her back. She looked externally calm, but Lucas could sense the tension. He had grown too familiar with the subtle internal shifts in her posture, the way her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly when she was deliberately guarding something profound inside. He took a deep, steadying breath and gave a firm knock. The door opened only halfway at first, Sophie holding it tightly with one hand, her other arm crossed protectively over her stomach, as if she were bracing herself for a physical blow. "Lucas," she said, her voice polite but still distant, carefully measured. "What brings you here this morning?" He swallowed hard. "Brought you something," he managed. She glanced cautiously at the strange bundle in his hand, then back up at his face with a guarded, wary expression that instantly made his stomach plummet. "I baked it," he added quietly, the admission feeling monumental. That earned a quick, surprised blink. Sophie had likely never, in her wildest dreams, imagined Lucas Grant standing anywhere near a kitchen oven. But instead of softening, her chin lifted slightly, her guard strengthening. "You should bring that to the girl you seem to like," she said, her voice sharp and controlled. "I'm sure she'll be happy to get it." The unexpected words landed with the stunning, painful force of a crack of thunder. Lucas stared at her, momentarily stunned, then let out a low, disbelieving and warm laugh. "Sophie," he said, shaking his head gently, "that girl is not Lily." Her breath audibly caught. The change in her dark eyes was so subtle most people would have missed it entirely. A sudden flicker of deep-seated doubt melting instantly into confusion, then something much gentler, something dangerously close to hope. She shifted slightly, her protective arms slowly loosening. "It's not." The question barely escaped her lips. Lucas took a deliberate step forward, just enough for her to see the absolute honesty etched onto his face. "No, Sophie. Lily is a very old friend. More like a sister than anything else. I haven't seen her in years, and she just shows up with a hug and a kiss on the cheek, just like she always did. That's just Lily. That's her way." He paused, letting the silence hang. "But she is absolutely not the one I brought this for." Sophie looked quickly down, as if trying to physically steady her trembling legs. "I saw you too," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "You seemed so close, so comfortable." He let out a soft, rueful breath. "We were catching up, that's all we were doing. And if it looked like something else, I'm truly sorry you had to see it that way, but I figured you knew me well enough by now to trust that I wasn't making silent promises to anyone else." She swallowed hard, the effort visible in her throat, her voice a raw whisper. "I didn't think I had any right to trust anything." The profound honesty in her words struck him deeper than he had expected. "Sophie," he said gently, taking another small step, "you've had people hurt you deeply. I get that, I truly do. But please don't put me in the same group as them." For a few heavy seconds neither of them moved. The quiet stretched, awkward, fragile, but strangely warm. The wind rustled the cottonwoods behind the cabin, carrying the unmistakable sweet scent of her baking across the yard. Finally, Sophie slowly stepped back and opened the door wider, a silent invitation. "Would you like to come in? I was just making some tea." Lucas nodded, the relief washing through him so quickly and completely he nearly sagged against the doorframe. "I'd like that very much." Inside, the cabin felt immediately different, cozy, distinctly warmer than usual, though neither of them commented on it. Sophie poured the tea with steady, practiced hands, but her eyes kept nervously drifting to the burlap-wrapped, lopsided loaf resting on the small table. "Is it edible?" she asked, a faint, nervous hint of humor in her tone. Lucas chuckled, a low, genuine sound. "If not, we can use it as a sturdy doorstop." That earned the smallest, shyest laugh from her, soft, brief, but utterly real. The tension, rooted in days of miscommunication, didn't vanish completely. A thin, invisible wall still stood between them, a structure built from old, deep wounds, one crucial misunderstanding, and the fears neither of them yet knew how to accurately name. But for the very first time since that terrible morning in town, they were finally on the same side of the door. Tea steamed gently between them. The terrible cornbread sat warm and solid on the table, and something fragile, something hopeful, hung quietly in the space where the devastating silence used to reside. The storms that afflicted Red Creek did not possess the courtesy to ask permission before crashing violently into the world. They rose out of nowhere, wild, heavy, and completely unpredictable, rolling over the open prairie like a living, angry beast with a voice full of primordial fury. That particular night, the wind arrived earlier than any rancher had expected, howling down from the ridge with a brute force that made even the thickest cottonwood trees bow low in submission. Sophie Harper had heard a lifetime of storms. She had lived through desert winds fierce enough to peel bark from ancient pines. But something in the quality of this night profoundly unsettled her, an eerie echo of old, buried fears, the kind that always tightened her chest into a painful knot and sent her pulse racing uncontrollably. The first catastrophic crash came when a loose plank from the old corral violently slammed into the side of her cabin. The entire wall shuddered and groaned violently. Flower jars rattled loudly on her shelves. A bowl toppled over and shattered instantly on the floor. Sophie's breath caught sharply as the window latch failed entirely, the wooden frame bursting inward and admitting a stunning blast of freezing, aggressive air. The wind roared inside, savagely whipping her long braid, scattering loose papers everywhere and sending hot sparks from the hearth flying across the floor. Her immediate, visceral instinct was not to hide, not to brace the heavy door, not to pray for the storm's passing. Her instinct was to run. Before she even consciously realized what her feet were doing, she snatched a thick wool shawl from its hook, wrapped it quickly around her shoulders and pushed out, straight into the raging, violent wind. Her lantern nearly blew out twice before she gave up shielding it, deciding instead to let the powerful storm guide her desperate path. Only one place felt truly safe. Only one person. Lucas. Lucas pulled a chair close to the fire and motioned for her to sit down. She obeyed instantly, letting the crackling warmth seep deeply into her palms. The wool shawl slipped a little, and Lucas gently adjusted it, his fingertips briefly grazing her shoulder. She didn't flinch this time. Outside, the wind still raged, rattling the shutters, shaking the foundation, demanding attention. Inside, the profound silence between them shifted, deepened, now thick with fragile, unspoken truths. Lucas sat beside her, close but carefully not touching, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "You are safe here, Sophie. As long as I'm breathing, you will never weather a storm alone again." Her eyes closed for a long moment, the simple, powerful words washing over her with a tenderness she had never prepared for. When she looked at him again, the panic had faded, replaced by something quieter and infinitely braver. He felt it too. The storm outside roared with savage force, but in that small, warm cabin, two hearts finally found a calmer, synchronized rhythm. Steady, soft, and utterly undeniable. The wind could tear fences apart, splinter wood, and shake foundations. But tonight, it had broken something else instead, the last fragile barrier standing between them. The great storm slowly began to ease its fury, though its echoes still rattled the persistent shutters like an impatient drummer. Inside Lucas's cabin, the fire continued to burn warmly and brightly, filling the small, secure room with that golden, flickering glow that possessed the magical quality of making everything feel instantly softer, instantly safer. Sophie sat peacefully, still enveloped in the thick quilt he had given her, remaining close enough to the hearth that she could feel the deep heat sinking satisfyingly into her chilled bones. Lucas watched her carefully, not intrusively, never that, but with a quiet, unwavering attentiveness that made Sophie's pulse flutter with a new, gentle excitement. He sat on the worn chair directly beside hers, his elbows resting solidly on his knees, his face half lit by the shifting firelight. Outside, the wind still cried a mournful sound against the windows, but inside, a different, more powerful tension had taken its place, a soft, gentle, and achingly palpable tension of anticipation. Finally, Sophie exhaled slowly, her voice low and careful, barely above a whisper that the fire nearly drowned out. "Lucas, about the other day." He met her eyes instantly, not surprised by the topic, only by her bravery in raising it. Her fingers nervously tugged at the quilt's edge, her knuckles white and tight. "When I saw you with Lily, I thought—" She swallowed hard, struggling to force the words past the sudden tightness in her throat. I thought you had someone already." Lucas blinked, surprised not by her confession, but by the raw, deep pain woven inextricably into the tone of her voice. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Sophie, but—" She raised a timid hand, stopping him for a fleeting moment. "Please, let me finish." Her breath trembled slightly. The firelight caught the deep-seated worry in her eyes, transforming it into something intensely vulnerable and raw. "In my tribe," she continued quietly, recounting the painful past she rarely shared, "people only ever needed one small, inconsequential reason to turn their back on someone like me. One simple misunderstanding, one perceived flaw, one moment of true weakness." Her voice dropped even lower. "I learned never to expect anyone to stay for long." Lucas felt something deep inside his chest violently twist, a sudden surge of anger at the people who had clearly hurt her, mixed with a profound tenderness for the incredibly brave woman sitting in front of him, fighting for her words. A fierce, protective courage fought to rise in his throat. Sophie looked down at her hands. "So when I saw you with her, I felt—" The word stuck again, a massive lump of fear. She forced the final word out anyway. "Jealous." The admission hung naked and trembling in the warm air, a single powerful truth finally spoken after years of forced silence. Lucas did not laugh. He did not tease. He did not, under any circumstances, allow her to sit in that exposed vulnerability alone. Instead, he reached out his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away from him, and rested his large, work-worn hand gently over hers. His voice, when it came, was steady, low, and impossibly sincere. "Sophie, I only want you." The room seemed to distill around them. The fire crackled softly, the wind outside quieted at the door, and time paused momentarily between one heartbeat and the next. She inhaled sharply, her eyes lifting to his with something that looked like disbelief, quickly followed by confusion, then dangerous hope. "Why?" she whispered, the single question holding years of doubt. "Because when you walk into a room," he said, his thumb brushing slowly and softly over her knuckles, "everything in me settles. Because you are strong and gentle all at once, a balance I admire. Because you see the world in a way that truly makes me want to be a better man. And because I've never met anyone else who makes this place, my life, feel less empty and less harsh." Her eyes glistened, not from immediate sadness, but from something infinitely lighter and impossibly fragile. "And Lily?" she managed to ask again, needing the final confirmation. Lucas shook his head with a soft, confident smile. "Lily's like a sister to me. Nothing more. Never was, never will be." Sophie let out a slow, profound breath, one she hadn't realized she had been tensely holding for days. Relief washed over her, warm and quiet, instantly loosening the physical knot that had been tight inside her chest. Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. "I was afraid you'd walk away. Like before. Like they all did." Lucas tightened his grip on her hand. Not possessive, not demanding, but profoundly grounding and protective. "Sophie," he said softly, his conviction ringing true, "you are not being left behind. Not by me. Not ever." Those simple, steady words, spoken in the pure, honest glow of a crackling fire, slipped effortlessly through the last, fragile barrier around her heart. Tears threatened, but she bravely blinked them back, leaning closer to him without consciously realizing she was moving. Lucas shifted instinctively, closing the tiny distance between them just enough for her to feel his immense, comforting warmth. For a long, suspended moment, neither moved an inch. The fire painted their faces in shifting gold and copper hues. The violent storm faded to a distant, gentle murmur outside. Their hands, still intertwined and resting between them, felt like a sacred, unspoken promise. Then slowly, so slowly, giving her every possible chance to refuse or pull back, Lucas tilted his forehead gently toward hers. She met him halfway, drawn to him like a breath she realized she'd been desperately waiting her whole life to release. Their lips finally touched, light, tender, and trembling with all the powerful, urgent words they hadn't dared to speak aloud. It wasn't urgent or demanding. It was profound honesty finally spoken in the only language they both truly trusted. A quiet, gentle kiss in a small wooden cabin, with the fire warming their tired faces and a fragile, immense hope stirring strongly between them. Outside, the night still raged across the dark hills. But inside, two hearts had finally found a safe, steady place to rest. The morning after the terrifying storm felt exactly like waking up into a brand new, gentler world. The hills surrounding Red Creek were washed immaculately clean, the air sharp and clean with the fresh scent of wet, fertile earth and juniper wood. Sophie and Lucas stood side by side in the soft grey light of dawn, silently surveying the damage the wind had brutally left behind. Fence rails were scattered like fallen matchsticks. Loose shingles dangled precariously from the roof eaves. Broken, thick branches lay scattered everywhere. But for the very first time, neither of them faced the massive mess alone. Lucas handed her a pair of sturdy work gloves, his eyes warm and completely open beneath the brim of his hat. "Ready to tackle this together?" Sophie nodded once, a soft, confident smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I am." They worked steadily through the entire morning, lifting the heavy rails, resetting the dislodged posts, and gathering the broken wood for the fire pile. Every now and then, their shoulders brushed against each other, and each time it happened, their gazes lingered just a little longer than necessary, sharing a secret smile. The lingering awkwardness of the past week had completely melted away, replaced by something steadier, sweeter, and quietly growing stronger with each shared, simple task. By noon, the fence stood perfectly straight again, visibly stronger and more secure than it had ever been before. Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing at Sophie with that small, specific, secret smile he had begun saving just for her. "You know," he said, leaning on his hammer, "you make hard work feel remarkably easy." Sophie laughed softly, a warm, tender sound that still surprised her with its sudden freedom. "That's only because you still do most of the actual lifting, Lucas." They returned to the cabin for a brief, shared lunch, bringing the warmth of the noon sun with them. Sophie laid out a fresh honey loaf, and Lucas brewed his signature coffee, so strong it could raise a ghost. They ate comfortably on the porch steps, watching the clouds drift lazily over the vast valley. Sophie tucked her legs beneath her shawl. Lucas leaned back on his palms, relaxed. The world seemed immensely quiet in that shared moment, still, peaceful, and almost sacred. From the dusty road below, two ranch wives passed slowly by on horseback. One politely waved. The other called out teasingly, her voice carrying on the crisp air. "Well now, if it isn't Red Creek's favorite pair. You two go together like flour and honey." Sophie's cheeks flushed a delicate pink. Lucas chuckled low in his chest, tipping his hat in calm acknowledgement. The women rode off, still laughing, spreading whispers that were more a blessing than malicious gossip. And truth be told, neither Sophie nor Lucas minded the attention in the slightest. The days that followed settled into a comfortable new rhythm, one built on quiet warmth rather than careful, necessary distance. Sophie began bringing warm loaves to Lucas in the mornings without question. Lucas repaired a sticking shutter or fixed a squeaky hinge without ever being asked for the favor. In the evenings, they shared long, quiet conversations on the porch, watching the vast sky turn from burning gold to deep, bruised violet. They didn't hurry anything. They didn't feel the need to label or name what was powerfully forming between them. They simply allowed it to grow, the way prairie flowers bloom, slow, natural, steady, deeply rooted in good, prepared soil. One quiet afternoon, as they watched people pass slowly through town, Lucas cleared his throat, a sure sign of nervousness. "You ever truly think about opening a place in town, Sophie? A little shop, maybe? You could sell all your wonderful bread, and I could take in my repair work right out of the back shed." Sophie looked at him, startled at first, then softened completely. "You'd want that? Us working together all the time?" Lucas shrugged, though a familiar flush crept up his strong neck. "Seems to me we already make a very good team, Sophie. Might as well let the whole town finally benefit from it." The simple idea planted itself firmly in Sophie's heart, like a seed ready for the spring thaw, a future not made of fear or running, but one built with her own two hands, right beside the one person who had chosen to stay. And so the plan quietly began, Not with grand announcements or sudden, huge changes, but with simple, hopeful talk over coffee and warm bread. Just like everything else between them, days stretched into comfortable weeks, and one quiet morning, as the faint dawn crept over the familiar hills, they found themselves sitting close together on Lucas's porch, wrapped tightly in blankets against the lingering chill. Sophie rested her head lightly against his shoulder, and Lucas let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding on to. He turned slightly, his voice low, but absolutely sure. "You know, if you hadn't gotten jealous that day, I might never have truly figured out just how much I need you, Sophie Harper." Sophie laughed softly, a warm, tender sound that seeped into the growing light. "Then perhaps, Lucas, it was entirely worth the trouble," she whispered, leaning closer into his warmth. The sun broke over Red Creek, spilling bright gold across the land, across the cabin, and across the two figures on the porch who finally allowed themselves to fully share a sunrise without any fear. And there, in that simple, profound moment, barefoot, wrapped in quilts, their hands brushing as naturally as breath, Sophie and Lucas stepped completely into a new life. Not rushed, not forced, but built slow and sturdy, like every good fence, every warm loaf of bread, and every lasting love on the vast, demanding frontier. The gentle beginning of everything, woven from the smallest, most ordinary miracle, choosing each other.